Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to today's book discussion with Andy Greenberg and Joseph Cox, here with us to discuss Andy's newest book, Tracers in the Dark, The Global Hunt for the Crime Lords of Cryptocurrency. We have a good-sized crowd here today, virtually, so let's get started. So cryptocurrency is everywhere in the news these days. The FTX crypto exchange fallout and its domino effect on other crypto continue to dominate as observers and investors monitor the ongoing damage. Meanwhile, Andy, I think you need to mute yourself for a second. Good. Meanwhile, crypto is elsewhere in the news, for example, in the war in Ukraine, where crypto assets are being used for donations to fund the Ukraine government and NGOs. And the Biden administration and Congress are trying to play catch up in an area best described, many say, as the wild, wild west. Earlier this fall, federal agencies came up with a joint fact sheet on 6 principles and directions for crypto regulation in the United States. Congress is only in infant stages in trying to understand and regulate cryptocurrency and its various manifestations. Even closer to home, last week, New York Governor Kathy Hochul signed one of the most restrictive laws in the US on regulating cryptocurrency mining, becoming the first state to impose such a ban, banning certain Bitcoin mining operations. At the center of this discussion about crypto, financial volatility, and domestic and geopolitical affairs is the phenomenon of crypto criminals and their ability to exploit the Wild West that defines the cryptocurrency world. Andy, you can disagree with any of this when you talk. With us today to describe the criminal sphere in cryptocurrency and efforts to address that criminality are 2 experts whose work speaks directly to many of the issues that converge in the crypto space. Andy Greenberg is the author of Tracers in the Dark. He's a writer at Wired, where he covers security, privacy, information freedom, and hacker culture. He's the author of the book Sandworm, A New Era of Cyber War and the Hunt for the Kremlin's Most Dangerous Hackers, for which he and Joseph did an event here in 2019. So that means in 3 years, you guys will be back. Oh no, we'll do Joseph's book before that. Like his fellow discussant, Joseph Cox, Andy has won numerous journalism awards. Joseph Cox is a journalist for Vice. He covers cybersecurity, the digital underground, and the surveillance industry for Vice's technology section, Motherboard. Among the issues Joseph has covered, and one that may interest many of us here at the Center on National Security, is the security of phone networks and how governments and corporations sell personal data for profit. His forthcoming book, Dark Wire, will tell the story of how the FBI used its secretly run tech startup called Anom to wire hundreds of organized crime gangs globally. And I hear that Netflix plans to turn the book into a movie. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Joe will start it. Andy, and he will talk for much of the hour. Then we will turn to audience questions in the latter part of the session. So feel free to put your questions in the chat and I will introduce them to our 2 discussants. Just FYI, this session is being recorded. Joe, I turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction. Andy, this is a very complicated, not narrative. The book itself is incredibly well written, and you follow the myth of the anonymous cryptocurrency and how that was shattered, and then that expands and expands. But I guess just for everybody watching, we should probably establish, first of all, what is this myth of anonymous cryptocurrency, and crucially, how did you come to write this book? Because I think both of those are basically intertwined. You know, how did you come to write this, and how does that relate to the myth of anonymous Bitcoin?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Karen, for that kind introduction. It's so nice to be doing something with the Center on National Security again, and a fellow Greenberg, no relation as always. But especially I want to thank Joe, though, also for joining. I mean, Joe has been like my frenemy competitor in this world of dark web coverage and scooped me many times over the years, and now just an actual friend. And I really appreciate having a partner in this discussion who knows so much about this world. So yeah, just to get into how I came to this story. So I guess like a little over a decade ago, I was really obsessed with this group called the cypherpunks, who was this movement from the 1990s, these sort of radical crypto libertarians and they call themselves crypto anarchists even, who believed that they could use encryption tools and anonymity tools enabled by encryption to take power away from governments and corporations and give it to individuals. And they dreamt up, things that would become VPNs and Tor and the dark web, essentially. And that's where WikiLeaks came from, for instance. Julian Assange was a cypherpunk too, who dreamt of using these tools to give anonymity to journalistic sources. But then in 2011, just as I was writing a book that was kind of in some ways a history of the cypherpunks, I came upon what seemed to be this new cypherpunk invention, which was Bitcoin. That's how it was described to me initially. And one of the first developers of Bitcoin, Gavin Andreessen, sort of introduced it in a talk that way that I watched, and it was described as this untraceable, anonymous digital cash for the internet. I mean, it's hard to believe that we talked about Bitcoin that way back then, but we truly did. And even Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin, who we still don't know, is he or she or they, wrote in their first email describing Bitcoin to a cryptography mailing list that participants can be anonymous. So I really believed this, and I wasn't alone. Very quickly, Bitcoin was adopted for things like the Silk Road, this black market on the dark web for drugs and other contraband of every kind imaginable. And it really seemed like it was working. Bitcoin was monetizing this new anonymous underworld of the internet, and that it was a way to kind of send a briefcase full of unmarked bills from anywhere across the internet to anywhere else in the world without identifying yourself. And only now, not quite now, but only about almost a decade later that I kind of fully have this epiphany that actually it was the opposite, that Bitcoin was the opposite of untraceable, that it was in fact extremely traceable. And that not only that, but it had served as a kind of trap for people seeking financial privacy, and particularly criminals, cyber criminals of every stripe, for years and years. And once I sort of saw that this had happened, it came from seeing Justice Department announcements of takedowns. And in each one, they credited this one company called Chainalysis, which was, I knew at the time, a cryptocurrency tracing firm. And it's began, I'd sort of read the research, I'd seen hints over the years of how traceable cryptocurrency was. But once I saw how many of these cases Chainalysis specifically, this startup tracing cryptocurrency, was involved in, I saw that in fact, this had been a incredibly powerful, almost secret weapon for law enforcement for years. And that's when I started talking to Chainalysis, and then they were the first to tell me about some of the major cases that had not been told before. And I then went from there to finding sources within the law enforcement agencies and the prosecutors who had done these cases, and as well as some of the criminal suspects and themselves, and trying to tell this
before we go
story.
down into that scale, though, well, one point is that yes, even before Chainalysis, I think there's another link between you and the dark web. There's another link between you specifically Bitcoin. Is that, you bought drugs on the dark web, and this is of course mentioned in the book. And I just want to touch on that briefly, because at that point in time, when you bought some cannabis off Silk Road or whatever, you believed Bitcoin was anonymous at that point, or you were at least exploring that idea, right? And that was shattered for you personally. Can you just briefly go through that? Because it's almost like a very small scale Chainalysis, you know what I mean? And then we'll move on to that.
Absolutely, yes. So I think, so when the Silk Road first appeared, I got pretty obsessed with not just the Silk Road drug market itself, but particularly its creator, this guy who called himself the Dread Pirate Roberts. And he was this, hyper libertarian ideological figure for that Silk Road community. And I interviewed him eventually in 2013. And for that piece, I worked at Forbes magazine at the time. As just a sidebar to the piece, I wanted to buy marijuana from 3 different dark web drug markets. At the time, of course, I said that Forbes was buying it in the piece. And now I can admit that I was just buying these drugs myself and sending them to the Fordham. And having done this, I then, did a little piece on what the experience of buying actual drugs online from the Silk Road and 2 of its kind of copycat sites. But then just after that, this paper came out called A Fistful of Bitcoins, characterizing payments between men with no names, which was this seminal paper. It turned out that, well, I even knew at the time that it showed that it was possible to some degree to trace Bitcoins. I think the degree to which it was possible, the full traceability of Bitcoin didn't become clear to me until years later. But when that paper came out, I asked its author, its lead author, Sarah Micklejohn, this researcher at the University of California, San Diego, to see if she could trace my Bitcoins, to trace the Bitcoins that I'd used to actually buy drugs on the Silk Road and other markets. And she did quite easily. And she demonstrated to me that like my illegal transactions, and they were illegal at the time, could be traced. But I don't know, it's amazing like how persistent this illusion of Bitcoin's potential for anonymity still was, because I thought like, well, I wasn't very careful. I didn't like move my Bitcoins through enough obfuscating hops around the blockchain. I didn't like use anonymity tools properly. If I was just a little better at this, then I would have been able to evade her tracing. And I think that is the mindset of every cyber criminal who's used cryptocurrency over in that period. They all thought that they could stay a step ahead. I should say like also why it is that Bitcoin seemed to be anonymous. And that is because, this sounds ridiculous now. The Bitcoin is enabled by the blockchain. This, instead of like being sort of guaranteed by a bank or a government, or like there's nobody checking every transaction at an institution like that. But the blockchain is instead this list of every Bitcoin transaction that is recorded, copied out to thousands of computers around the world, and cannot be changed. And that is a list of sorry to repeat this, but it's nuts to think about the fact that we thought this could be anonymous. A list of every Bitcoin transaction ever made, but all you can see on the blockchain is like which Bitcoin address sent money to which other address. And that back in 2011 looked like it was a kind of if not anonymity, then pseudonymity. Like if you can't figure out somebody's Bitcoin addresses, then you'll never figure out their transactions. You'll never be able to follow the money from one address to the next in any meaningful way, or tell where it's going or what's illegal or legal. But Sarah Micklejohn was the one who began to crack that code and to show that with some clever tricks. I don't know if we need to like get into them exactly. They're like fun to talk about, but like a little in the weeds maybe. She began to show that you could actually tie together sometimes dozens or thousands, eventually millions of Bitcoin addresses, and show they all belong to one person or institution like the Silk Road. And then you could actually, using other tricks sometimes, follow that money from hop to hop until it reached something like a cryptocurrency exchange, where she knew that a law enforcement agency could send a subpoena and start to like actually get people's identifying information from that exchange. So that's like how I sort of suffered from the same illusion. I thought, well, if I could just like defeat those, if I worked harder to defeat those tricks, I could have still done this anonymously. After all, the Silk Road had been online at that point for 2.5 years, and nobody seemed to be tracing the Bitcoins of the Dread Pirate Roberts, for instance. And so, it didn't seem to me like cryptocurrency could be used to actually capture criminals. But that was about to change.
Right, exactly. And that comes on to what I was going to ask next, which is before the scale of Chainalysis, we're still pretty early. There is a seminal case, right? The tracing of the Bitcoins belonging and stolen by corrupt law enforcement officials. Ironically, working on the Silk Road investigation, as someone who's covered those cases, this was all new to me. This was all entirely new to me. The background story of how this actually came about, and at least my understanding from reading the book is that this was the first time we know of that Bitcoin tracing was used by a law enforcement agency to get evidence to put somebody in jail. I mean, this is a hugely significant moment. Do you just want to run us through sort of what that story is and where it takes us?
Absolutely. It is bizarre that like after 2.5 years of the Silk Road being online, it was pulled off. It was the Dread Pirate Roberts was identified as this 29-year-old guy, Ross Ulbricht, living in San Francisco. The Silk Road server was found through potentially anonymities in the Tor anonymity software. vulnerabilities rather, in Tor, but then also through like some slip ups that Ross Ulbricht had made, like leaking his email address in a forum post made years earlier. He wasn't caught through cryptocurrency tracing. The first cryptocurrency tracing case that actually proved somebody's guilt, instead, as you were saying, was bizarrely this case where an IRS criminal investigator who had not been involved in the Silk Road takedown, this guy named Tigran Gumbarian, I think he actually felt a bit left out of the Silk Road case, and his superiors certainly were like, why weren't we on top of this? Tigran was based in Oakland, right across the bay from San Francisco, where Ross Ulbricht was arrested. And I think there was a sense of like, this guy was right under our nose. Why did we not figure this out? Tigran began to look at the Silk Road investigation after the fact, got a tip from a cryptocurrency exchange that one of the DEA investigators in that Silk Road case, a guy based in Baltimore named Karl Mark Force, was cashing out hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Bitcoins of unknown origin. And so Tigran, like this was still a point in history when everybody thought Bitcoin was more or less, untraceable. Certainly within law enforcement, nobody was tracing Bitcoins. But Tigran looked at this blockchain and was like, why can't I trace this? He had, audited tax returns for years. He was an accountant. And aside, in addition to being a law enforcement agent who carried a gun and made arrests and stuff, that's the weirdness of IRS criminal investigations. And he sat down at his computer like after hours and just hand traced on the blockchain Karl Mark Force's Bitcoin transactions and showed that they had come from the Silk Road, that the money that he was getting and cashing out these Bitcoins were in fact payments from the Dread Pirate Roberts himself to Karl Mark Force in exchange for essentially acting as a mole inside the DEA and selling law enforcement investigative information to the Silk Road as a double agent. I mean, it's bizarre. But then Tigran, after proving this, and Karl Mark Force is indicted, prosecutors, like there was still this, they could see that there was this other sum of missing money, like $350,000 worth of Bitcoins that they couldn't tell where it went. Everybody, all the prosecutors on this case believed that it must have gone to Karl Mark Force also, this corrupt DEA agent. And Tigran alone looked at the blockchain and was like, I see this going somewhere else. And he traced those coins and found that they had actually been stolen by a Secret Service agent, also assigned to the Silk Road investigation, also in Baltimore, kind of amazingly, 2 corrupt agents in Baltimore who had been assigned to the Silk Road case had been stealing as much money as they could from the case in every way they could think of, like theft, extortion, selling information to the Dread Pirate Roberts. And these 2 guys, Karl Mark Force at the DEA and Sean Bridges at Secret Service, were both indicted and spent years in prison. And that was, this bizarre case was the first time that cryptocurrency was ever traced to prove someone's guilt. And it's like, I don't know, it's been described to me almost like lightning striking twice. Like, what are the odds that 2 agents on the same case, and by the way, they did not even know about each other's crimes. They were not even aware of each other, even though they worked in the same office, and they were both stealing Bitcoins from the same case. But what are the odds that like these 2 federal agents would both have fallen for this, corrupt behavior? But it seemed to me like it's actually, you can sort of understand how it happened if you think about the case at the time. I mean, the Silk Road was one of the first major cryptocurrency crime cases. And these agents were laboring under the illusion that they could just grab any Bitcoins they could get their hands on and could not be traced. And they were both seduced by this same false promise of untraceable money, when it turned out to be anything but, like, truly the opposite.
Right, exactly.
Exactly.
And of course, from there, this is when stuff starts to ramp up a bit. We've had that seminal case. Chainalysis is it's still a scrappy startup at this point, or maybe it hasn't even started. Please correct me on that. But they're getting ready, and they start looking for contracts, looking for law enforcement contracts as well. Eventually, how does that transition happen? And I think after this, I want to talk about the next major case in the book, which is told incredibly well, and there are some scenes I want to touch on there, which is AlphaBay. But before that, just slightly, where is Chainalysis here, and what is it exactly? You touched on it just briefly, but what are we even talking about?
Right. So, first of all, Chainalysis was founded by this Danish guy, Michael Groninger, who was an old school Bitcoiner, and I think had always believed that Bitcoin would be traceable. Then he read Sarah Mickeljohn's paper, and I think like that only cemented his notion of what was possible. And he created this company, Chainalysis, in part to solve a very specific mystery, which was the theft of $500 million worth of Bitcoins from the first cryptocurrency exchange, Mt. Gox. Now feels like a familiar story these days with FTX, but like Mt. Gox was this massive exchange that suddenly went bankrupt, had lost everybody's money. They blamed hackers, but a lot of people suspected that it was the staff. And Groninger created Chainalysis, this cryptocurrency tracing startup, in part to try to solve this mystery. And in a sense to rescue Bitcoin, which was foundering, after this massive bankruptcy of a central institution. But then, just as he was starting it, he met Tigran Gambaryan just by chance in San Francisco, and they worked together actually to trace the Bitcoins of Sean Bridges, that Secret Service agent. Michael Groninger kind of checked Tigran's work, proved that together that was in fact this corrupt Secret Service agent. And so then they were this kind of unlikely team, this like combative IRS criminal investigator, and Groninger, this like very sort of like intellectual academic almost Danish guy who had started Chainalysis. And then they ended up working on the same case again in a really unlikely way. Tigran Gambaryan, the IRS, began to look into this other cryptocurrency exchange called BTCE that was this like extremely shady exchange where it seemed like all sorts of criminals were cashing out cryptocurrency from early ransomware operations, from dark web markets that came about after the Silk Road, that replaced the Silk Road, and all sorts of other crimes. And meanwhile, Groninger was looking into the Mt. Gox mystery, trying to find that $500 million of stolen money. It turned out that money had been fed into BTCE. And just to skip ahead a little bit, the remarkable thing is that Groninger and Gambaryan together figured out that the same person was both involved with the hackers who had stolen all of Mt. Gox's money, bankrupted the company, as was also running BTCE. So this one person who turned out to be this Russian man named Alexander Vinnik, I guess, he's still fighting these charges. He's innocent until proven guilty. But he allegedly, at least, not only helped to steal this money, but then created an entire cryptocurrency exchange because he had so much dirty money on his hands that he needed to create an exchange to launder it. And that's what BTC was. And then it became, also just a really prolific and profitable way to cash out all kinds of other criminal cryptocurrency. And Vinnik, Alexander Vinnik, this Russian, eventually did travel outside of Moscow. He went to Greece on vacation and was arrested. And that was, in some ways, the first crime on a massive scale that was solved through cryptocurrency tracing. And it was carried out. That mystery was solved of who stole the Mt. Gox money in some sense, and who was behind this shady exchange BTCE. And it was Gambaryan and Groninger, IRS and Chainalysis together who figured that out. And they are the kind of like really powerful team that, I don't know, would go on to solve like one massive case after another for the rest of the story of this book, which goes on for years to come, and each case is kind of bigger than the last.
Right, exactly. And then the big case after that, and the one which includes a ton of new reporting, which again I wasn't aware of, even though I covered AlphaBay shutting down. AlphaBay was, it became the king of the dark web. I think it was something like multiple times larger than the Silk Road, right? They sold stuff that Ross Ulbricht would never touch. It was just a lot more aggressive. That is actually the point in my coverage when I initially started just covering drugs because of Silk Road. AlphaBay comes along and they're selling a lot more hacked data. They're selling a lot more malware. And then that's when I personally pivot into hacking coverage and the sort of the more stuff that you did. So thanks, AlphaBay, for that, I guess. When it comes to the eventual shutdown of AlphaBay, cryptocurrency tracing is involved. There is a lot of drama, especially from the law enforcement side. Without any spoilers, the one scene I do just want to point out, which is incredible and insane, is eventually they track down the AlphaBay owner, and the agents responsible are sitting on the table next to their target in a Bangkok hotel by pure happenstance. And that's all incredibly told in the story. And that blew me away. I had no idea that happened. And I don't know, you couldn't make that up. Truly insane. But how do we get to that point? And importantly, how is cryptocurrency tracing related to that?
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting to be talking about this with you, because by the time there was this kind of whack-a-mole following the Silk Road, where like it was replaced when it was taken down by Silk Road 2, a copycat site that was basically run by some of the same staffers. That was easily taken down because law enforcement already knew those people. And then that was replaced by another dark web market, and then another, and then finally AlphaBay appeared. And by that time, I had actually kind of dropped off the ball to some degree. And you interviewed Alpha 02, this mysterious kingpin of AlphaBay, I remember. And I'd interviewed the Dread Pirate Roberts, but I had never even like really tried to seek out Alpha 02. I was like, this is just another dark web market. Little did I know that it would grow into a market 10 times the size of the Silk Road by its peak. And as you said, it was sort of a much darker like level of the dark web, or somewhat darker anyway. It had fewer rules. The Silk Road had this idea of only victimless crime. AlphaBay was full of like not only like heroin and fentanyl and things, but also just hacking tools, stolen data, credit card fraud. That's where Alpha 02, in fact, this creator of AlphaBay, had come from. He was a known credit card fraudster. And by like mid 2016, AlphaBay was the biggest dark web market ever. And Alpha 02 was this notorious figure who, I think probably not long after you interviewed him, sort of disappeared. In a sense, he kind of just changed his username to admin instead of like this cool name Alpha 02, and stopped talking to people on AlphaBay, just kind of slipped into the shadows. And I would later learn that he had become this sort of like public enemy number one of every dark web investigator. This story, I've been so obsessed with it for so long. I was kind of almost like just a happy coincidence that it turned out that this was solved with cryptocurrency tracing, because when I've actually been trying to tell the story of AlphaBay and its investigation and takedown for half a decade, practically. Eventually, this not only, I don't know, sorry, I'm skipping ahead here, but like it's an incredible, unprecedented investigation, because at the same time that AlphaBay eventually was taken down and Alpha 02 turned out to be this French-Canadian man living in Bangkok was arrested, the same group of agents, who included this Dutch police, took over the second biggest market, so that the refugees from AlphaBay would flood into a market that they were secretly controlling. They were running undercover. And that in 2017, when it was announced, was such a landmark operation that I knew that there was going to be like a crazy story about how they did this to tell. And I worked for years to try to get that story. And only really once I found that cryptocurrency tracing was the kind of key investigative tool did the whole thing kind of start to come together, and I started to find sources. But the case, I should say, sort of began with what sounds like a much more obvious kind of lead, which was that around Thanksgiving of 2016, a DEA agent in Fresno, of all places, received a tip, which was that in its first days online, when AlphaBay was just one of many dark web markets, and as I said, like it was hard to tell that it was interesting at that point. It had a bug where when you signed up for its user forum, you would receive a welcome email, and then that welcome email, there was in the metadata of it an email address that was pimpalex91@hotmail.com. That mistake was fixed rather quickly, but this one tipster had got that email, kept it for years until AlphaBay grew into this massive market, and then shared that with the DEA. And it turns out that Pimp Alex 91 was the Hotmail address of this kid, Alexander Cause. And when the Fresno investigators began to search for this, they found this guy, this French Canadian guy, who had like a sort of like hip hop career, they could see, and then had switched to web developments and moved to Bangkok, where they could see from like his family's social media, like his Thai wife and her family's posts, that he had a Lamborghini, he had a villa in the south of Thailand in Phuket. This was not like typical web developer stuff. But it almost seemed too good to be true that they had got this tip that just like had the guy's email address. And they wondered even then, the prosecutors and agents in Fresno, if they had the right guy or if maybe they were being set up. They thought, first of all, it wasn't enough to prove his guilt, but also they thought maybe that he was being framed. Maybe Cause was just the patsy for the real Alpha 02. And the way that they finally proved that it was Cause, that it was this guy, was through cryptocurrency tracing. And Chainalysis by 2016 had spent years looking at AlphaBay, which did some very clever things to try to evade the sort of tracing that was possible with the Silk Road. Like it's kept users' money distributed in like many, many thousands of addresses rather than ever pooling it together in a way that was identifiable, things like that. But Chainalysis, after 2 years of looking at this, had identified through their own kind of very clever fingerprints, like the fee structure of AlphaBay, for instance, the ways that like AlphaBay used Bitcoin fees specifically in this sliding scale was recognizable, it turned out. And they used that to build a map of 2.5 million addresses that were being used by AlphaBay buyers, sellers, and administrators. But then it was these 2 FBI agents who asked me just to call them Ali and Aaron, who worked in a totally different office of the FBI, on the other side of the country from Fresno. They were based in Washington, D.C., who had the kind of breakthrough idea of how to trace the money of AlphaBay's boss, which was this notion of looking at exit scams. Like, just to explain, of course know what an exit scam is, but an exit scam is when the creator or whoever's running a dark web market just steals everybody's money and runs away with it. And whenever this happens, users on the dark web warn each other, like, never store more money in a market than you are about to use, to pull all of your money out of the markets whenever you can. And these 2 FBI analysts, Aaron and Ali, realized that the only person who would never have to worry about an exit scam was the boss of a dark web market himself. And so they looked at this map that Chainalysis had created and tried to find within the AlphaBay cluster of addresses where there were big sums of money that had not moved even when an exit scam had happened. Like when everybody else was pulling out their money, the kingpin would leave it in those addresses. And they did identify a cluster within the cluster that they thought belonged to Alpha 02. They traced it out to multiple cryptocurrency exchanges. They actually sent a subpoena to one of those exchanges before they even heard the tip that Alexander Cause was Alpha 02. Before that kind of like spread across the grapevine from Fresno, they sent this subpoena. And then just after learning Alexander Cause's name, they got the results, which confirmed that yes, this account was in Cause's name. He was Alpha 02. Now this thing that had been kind of a theory hanging by a few threads was nailed to the wall with like actual follow the money evidence. They really like proved it. And then they continued to follow his money to like more than a dozen exchanges in his name and his Thai wife's name. And that was how they proved that Cause was the kingpin of this site. I mean, the story of how they then captured him is like one of the most like interesting and fun. I mean, it's not, I'm sorry to say it's fun. It's about somebody's life was at stake here, but like, but the Cause had learned from the Silk Road also that not only do you need to use encryption on the laptop you use to run your dark web market, but so that you can just close the lid of it. And if you just close that lid, then it's encrypted, law enforcement will never be able to access its secrets. But he learned also that you never log into the markets, you never open that laptop outside of your home. And he's in this home, like behind a gate in Bangkok, and somehow the agents need to catch him in a way where his laptop is open and alive and unlocked, logged into AlphaBay. And the story of how they did that is like, you know, one of the most elaborate kind of physical sting operations I've certainly the most elaborate I've ever written up, and I had to assemble it from like lots of different sources in Thailand and this Fresno group, and so it's just like I go far beyond the point of proving his guilt, but then there's also this whole story of how they took over the second biggest market and ran that in secret. I don't know how much we want to get into it.
I mean, before you get to that, you did mention a few times, of course, that you've spoken to law enforcement in Thailand and obviously the Americans and then some of the Dutch as well. At the top of this talk, you mentioned that, blockchain analysis has been something of a secret weapon, which is true. Why are these people talking now? And there are some things they won't talk about, but I'm just curious on the reporting process. Why do you think they spoke, and how did you get them to speak about this secret weapon that's been laying there dormant and nobody's been paying attention to it?
Yeah, it's an interesting, to call it a secret weapon, I think it was initially a surprise, a huge surprise for cryptocurrency criminals that they could be traced in this way. And part of the surprise is that they can't erase the evidence, even once they know that they can be traced. It's on the blockchain forever. So in that way, like it doesn't even need to remain secret in some sense, but to be effective. But then it is interesting to see that as this cat and mouse game develops, there have been like some advances that remain secret. Chainalysis would tell me a lot of things. They wouldn't tell me other techniques. Just in terms of like the kind of like, I don't know, question of like, how do you get these sources and agents and prosecutors to talk? I think that a lot of them felt that these stories like deserve to be told. They probably felt like they deserve some credit. Some people never did tell, didn't want their identities revealed. But I think just the epic nature of the cases, it felt like they had to tell somebody about them. They had to get the story out there. And it had been 5 years since the AlphaBay takedown. So these stories cool off a little bit, and then I don't know, they just are kind of like burning a hole in someone's pocket and they have to like make it public. But then they're also, I should say that like IRS criminal investigations was wonderful to speak to, because I think they feel perpetually undercredited. They're treated like accountants and like this nerdy, like second-rate law enforcement agency, when in fact they were the ones behind these enormous breakthroughs and are really central to the story of the book and have incredible investigators. But then there were parts of the story still that nobody wanted to really tell me how it happened. And one of them is how the AlphaBay server was found in Lithuania. There, I was told that Chainalysis and Tigran Gambarian at IRS had essentially partnered and come up with this technique that was described to me only as advanced analysis. And it had something to do with cryptocurrency, but it had allowed to find the IP address of AlphaBay's central computer and locate it in Lithuania. And that shouldn't be possible. There are no IP addresses on the blockchain. So that was a huge mystery and something that I like really grappled with. I think that the sources wanted me to just tell that part of the story as like a black box, like somehow, I can't say how, they wouldn't tell me they did this. And the reason they wouldn't tell me in part was because they were using this technique to take down, one dark web site markets, after another. And they used it again and again after AlphaBay for like probably half a dozen sites. And they wanted it to remain secret so that the administrators of these sites would not be able to fix their vulnerability. And each of them, just like each source in the story kind of told me like just enough that I was able to start piecing it together. Then I just speaking to like security researchers who could give me educated guesses about how it worked. I think come up with what I believed was the technique. And I was going to describe it. I was sort of torn about whether to describe it in the book or not. It's a really difficult decision. It's like an almost Edward Snowden kind of decision. Do you, like, when you know about a secret surveillance technique, do you blow it up? When people's privacy is at stake, there are definitely legitimate users of Bitcoin who would be really upset, I think, to hear about this, the fact that their dark web server's IP address can be found by Chainalysis. But then also, if you blow it up, if you burn this tool, then you are also protecting people running really abhorrent stuff on the dark web, like including child exploitation sites, which is a later part of the story of my book, and other really bad things. And I sort of lay awake at night at one point in the process of writing this book, like just trying to decide what to do. Like, do I reveal what I know about this technique? And like, thank God, just near the end of the reporting process, there was a leak from Chainalysis posted to the dark web that included a presentation in Italian that they'd given to the Italian federal police that included the description of the secret tool. So once it leaked onto the dark web, and it was actually shared with me by a dark web market administrator. So it clearly had gotten out. Like, the tool, I think, was somewhat burned at that point. And so the responsibility thankfully was taken off me. I felt like I could just like reveal what I knew about this without feeling like I was, I had this like ethical dilemma on my hands. So I do, reveal how that worked in the book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, that kind of leads to my last question just before we may take questions from the audience, in that that sort of brings us up to now, right? This tool is being burned, but it's certainly being used. Obviously, cryptocurrency tracing has never been more important, really. Sure, we all think about the dark web, we all think about Silk Road, AlphaBay, whatever, but FTX, of course, the massive crypto exchange, which is now closed down. People are going to try and trace those coins. I know through my own reporting, without getting super explicit, that top tier organized crime is using Bitcoin, 100%. Drug cartels in South America, this is how they are laundering proceeds. So that is how, maybe investigators will pivot to that as well. Just the last question is how what does it look like now? And what happens now with tracing?
It's really interesting to hear you say that, because it seems that like you're seeing drug cartels still using cryptocurrency for money laundering. Of course, the dark web drug markets and black markets still exist and persist. And in fact, I should say that, like, I should mention AlphaBay has resurrected itself years after the takedown in a new form that only uses Monero, this purportedly untraceable, or at least much harder to trace cryptocurrency. I think that the degree to which Monero can be traced is still like a really interesting subject, and I've seen examples of it traced. And in that same leaked Chainalysis presentation, they talk about tracing Monero. So I don't think that I think that same trap may be about, may be being sprung again on unsuspecting crypto users. But it seems to me, like, from what I can see, that there are that group of criminals who think that they're unidentifiable cryptocurrency is shrinking, even as the amount of cryptocurrency used in crime is growing. And that's in part because it's shifting, as so much cybercrime has, to countries where visibility, where tracing is not enough. Like, you can figure out exactly who carried out a ransomware attack. You can see like who they're partnered with, how they're like, sometimes even like how they're cashing out the money, but you can't stop them because they're, beyond the reach of Western law enforcement. And the same is true of North Korean hackers who are stealing billions of dollars of cryptocurrency to fund the Kim regime, like a true national security issue, but nothing can be done about it, because the fact remains that even though Bitcoin cryptocurrency is traceable, it is not always like censorable. It's not always, it's hard to stop the flow of it, even if you can see the flow of it. So that group of untouchable but highly visible cyber criminals, like, still is out there and using cryptocurrency. But I believe you when you say that there are still people who may be actually in extradition countries trying to get away with using cryptocurrency. And I think that, like, they are in many cases switching to less traceable cryptocurrencies. The degree to which any of them are untraceable is like an open question. I think Zcash is the most interesting to me, which uses very clever new cryptography tricks to possibly truly be untraceable. But then, to your point about FTX also, we are watching, like, in real time, this is still happening, as $500 million or so of FTX's funds, not just money that was like, irresponsibly invested or over leveraged or whatever, but money that was actually stolen, like, by somebody, like either an internal embezzlement or external hackers stole this hundreds of millions of dollars worth of FTX's funds. That money is on the move. Like, as you know, we're still, and more to the point, all the crypto tracers in my book are watching this money move. And it's very unlikely that whoever took it will be able to cash it out and make it usable without being identified because of everything we've been talking about. And so, you know, it's really interesting to see someone is trying to get away with stealing this money. But we will soon find out, I think, whether that was an internal theft or whether it was outside hackers. The mystery will probably be solved. And the question is like, will the thieves be reachable? Will they be like on shore enough that something can be done about it? Or maybe the money be recovered?
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
Should we take to questions, Karen?
Yes, I think this is a good time to turn to questions. It's kind of interesting because Andy's just answered a couple of the questions in that last answer about untraceable currency. What do you think the next untraceable currency would be? So you can answer that, but let me follow with another one, and then you could, which is, what's the international law enforcement dimension of this? And I think, you know, you can both talk about this if you'd like, because, you know, you keep mentioning the fact that this involves other countries, and whether it's for, you know, where the money's being hidden, or where the perpetrators, alleged perpetrators are being hid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what is the international law enforcement mechanism? Is it something formal? Are there countries that are better at this, at detecting and preventing and, you know, blocking this? Or I'd like to get a sense of that. And I think, could you answer that? And also, if there's more untraceable issues, you might want to talk about that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's worth talking about like the untraceable question. Like, are there untraceable cryptocurrencies today? That question. You know, I was the one who made the mistake in the first place of thinking Bitcoin was untraceable a decade ago. So it feels like I'm potentially falling into the same trap again. But I do believe, as I was just like mentioning briefly, that Zcash, this, you know, newer form of cryptocurrency, may actually be untraceable because it doesn't it doesn't have, like, it has a blockchain, but it's entirely encrypted. It uses like this very clever thing called zero knowledge proofs to essentially like verify a transaction happened, but without zero, you know, while revealing zero knowledge about anything about that transaction other than it took place as described. So it is like a very interesting and new form of cryptocurrency, relatively new, still being adopted. And if it starts to gain traction, I do think like we are in a new era where, you know, that these sort of crypto anarchist promises of the cypherpunks might actually come true in a way that they truly did not with Bitcoin. And whether, you know, it'll be, if Zcash is like adopted by more criminals, then the question is like, will cryptocurrency exchanges delisted, like not allow you to buy and sell it because it's a known criminal tool? If that's the case, can it still be used some other way, or will it kind of fall by the wayside? I mean, I think that we haven't actually seen Zcash adopted enough to know yet, but we may, as like, I don't know, more people understand how traceable all the other cryptocurrencies are. And then we may enter this new realm of like actual, you know, interesting crypto anarchy, as the cypherpunks were sort of like trying to bring about so long ago. But now to the other question about like the role of international law enforcement agencies. I mean, the book does, you know, the Dutch police, for instance, were the ones who traced cryptocurrency in part to find the administrators, to locate that second biggest dark web market, so that when AlphaBay was taken down, they were secretly controlling the number 2 sites. I mean, this is like such a brazen, incredibly like audacious thing that they did to run that dark web market for like more than a month themselves as the administrators, and then secretly surveil everybody inside. So there's no question that like some law enforcement agencies around the world are, I would say, like even more aggressive and good at this stuff than you know, the US, for instance. But I think that a more important point is probably just that Chainalysis, and in fact an entire industry of competitors now, are essentially contract firms. They are like crypto tracers for hire, essentially. They'll sell you the tools, they'll help you with consultation on like how to do this stuff. And hands-on investigative, like, stuff that they do for law enforcement agencies. Chainalysis is now just one of a bunch of firms like TRM Labs and Elliptic and CipherTrace that all do this, and they absolutely sell to non-US customers. So it's becoming like more of a commodity tool that people will, be able to buy in countries around the world. And I think that that's really interesting, but also a little disturbing in the sense that, like, you have to then ask, to what degree are they selling this to? Even if you do trust the U.S. government, like, to what degree is Chainalysis selling to, less savory governments around the world? And I did ask them this, and it's like kind of a gray area for them. And the Middle East in particular, I think, is really interesting. I would guess that, like, the UAE and other, like, pretty, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, this is an area where, like, these are U.S. allies in theory, and I guess in practice, and yet, like, they have terrible human rights abuses. And if anybody is, like, trying to use cryptocurrency in these countries, then they may be being traced with tools similar to the ones that have been used against, like, what we would consider, like, true criminals. And the question of, like, the abuse of these tools, not necessarily with Chainalysis help, but, like, there's now an entire industry of these companies. And in fact, there will be, no doubt, a Russian Chainalysis, a Chinese Chainalysis, if those countries are not developing these tools internally. And then the question is, like, what is, financial surveillance is a powerful tool, and not, despite, like, the fun cops and robbers stories that we've been talking about, is not an entirely good thing. Like, there was a reason why the cypherpunks wanted to evade this kind of surveillance. And the fact that cryptocurrency did not offer that escape, and in fact offered a trap for people seeking privacy, is not entirely a good thing. I mean, when we think about journalists and dissidents and activists who need privacy for good reason, often from repressive regimes internationally.
Joe, did you want to add in terms of what you found out with, global crime gangs and
just very briefly, from my own reporting, in that there is so much collaboration now, either if that's going to be in MLATs or that's going to be in task forces for particular operations. The US government, European governments, they have no issue with going and collaborating, say, with Dubai police or something like that. Just very, very briefly, Dubai used to be a safe haven for top-tier organized criminals, in some case cyber criminals. That's basically a myth now, in the same way that the anonymity of Bitcoin was a myth. You go to Dubai, the Dubai police are going to catch you and going to extradite you to Australia or something like that. So there is real change on the around the world when it comes to actually arresting these sorts of criminals. And maybe cryptocurrency tracing will play a part in that as well. As Andy was saying, you can trace the cryptocurrency, but what if you can't actually knock down the guy's door? In some cases you can knock down the guy's door, increasingly so.
We have another question. We have a few questions, actually. Could you see the difference in terms of levels of traceability among currencies that are now available? Like, that are, what's more traceable and what isn't? Or
Sure. I mean, I can speak to it as much as I'm sort of aware of it. And as I said, like, in more and more of this sort of, like, especially when it's sort of contemporary, it's hard to know the extent of anything's traceability, because that is kind of only becomes clear sometimes years later. But just briefly, I would say that, like, almost all cryptocurrencies are extremely traceable. They essentially have a blockchain, just like Bitcoins. On the other end of the spectrum is Zcash, which I already talked about, which is, like, I think pretty untraceable. I hesitate to say, but it looks that way. And then one step more traceable is Monero, which is a really interesting one that is used far more than Zcash and has been adopted, for instance, as the sole cryptocurrency of the new AlphaBay, which is now the biggest dark web market again, although it's still just a fraction of the size of the original. And Monero is like a hotly contested thing. Every time I write anywhere, like on Twitter, God forbid that, like, Monero can be traced in any way, I get attacked by all these Monero users who want it to be that perfectly untraceable currency. But in the theft of 120,000 Bitcoins from Bitfinex by these two alleged money launderers in New York, in the IRS public documents around that indictment, it really looked to me like they traced Monero in one part of the case. And I pointed this out and got a lot of attacks for it, but it really appears that way. And then also in that leaked Chainalysis document, they say that they can trace Monero. So, in between Zcash and like Bitcoin, the most traceable of all, or as traceable as anything, there is just a lot of gray area and a lot of debate.
One of the questions has to do with, and it just tells you how complex the conversation is. How hard is it to get on the dark web? Because it sounds like this sort of nether region, and the question is, what is that all about? How does that work? And I should have raised this earlier, but one of our questioners is curious, and I think that's a good one and then we have, go ahead.
I'll let Joe answer it because I feel like Joe lives on the dark web even more than I do, or did at one point. I'm not sure he still does.
Yeah, not so much anymore, but I definitely did for several hours a day. So there is this, again, a myth that the dark web is completely inaccessible. You can't Google the dark web, is often said, something like that. You can literally Google addresses to go to on the dark web. That's how I find them, But the actual process is you will go and download the Tor browser, which is based on Firefox, download it like any other sort of browser. You open it up, and that is routing your connection through different hops around the planet, computers run by volunteers. You are now technically on the Tor anonymity network. To get to the dark web, you'll find one of these addresses, which is a very long string of random characters, mostly random characters, .onion. So instead of .com or .co.uk, they're all .onion, which is linked to the layers of protection that Tor provides. And then you can go from there. If you want to find the addresses, you might go on normal Google and be like latest dark web addresses, something like that. But the only thing I would add is that, very interestingly, US law enforcement did target a website called deep.web several years ago. And that was sort of a news website for, this drama is happening in the dark web. But it also included trusted links to dark web sites. You could go, well, I know this is the AlphaBay link. It's not a phishing one. I know this is the Silk Road one. They got shut down because the administrator was actually taking kickbacks for providing traffic to those sites. So in the same way there is a bottleneck when it comes to the Bitcoin exchanges where law enforcement can go and subpoena and get records, there's, not as tight a bottleneck, but there's still sort of one on these public-facing websites that list all of the dark web marketplaces, because you could, get IP addresses of those if you were going to do a very broad investigation, or you just try to shut down that site as well. It's another bottleneck as the way into the dark web.
Thank you. We have one last question, and we're out of time, but I want to ask it anyway. Have you looked beyond the use of cryptocurrency and tracing by traditional ordinary criminals to whether and how they're used by governments and intelligence to mask payments and funding? And I think it's a good question that sort of goes into, all of this, the way in which we go after cryptocurrency. Where's the interface, particularly on the part of government intelligence, in terms of, normal criminal investigation as well as crypto?
I think the question is like, do intelligence agencies and do governments themselves use cryptocurrency? Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's like something I haven't heard like a lot about, but I can think of off the top of my head, like the example of the Russian hackers who breached the Democratic National Committee. That was ABT 28 and Sandworm, the subject of my last book, and these Russian military agency hackers, the GRU, and they absolutely did fund their infrastructure. They built their infrastructure using Bitcoin payments to pay for servers and things, and that was absolutely intended to hide their tracks. I'm not, and in fact, I think that they were some of the most careful about this of anyone I can think of. They, I think, even mined Bitcoins to try to avoid buying them somewhere where they could be identified. But nonetheless, Chainalysis talked to me about tracing those transactions, and I think that it was never exactly revealed how the Department of Justice was able to identify all these members by name and face of many of these Russian hacker groups, ABT 28 and Sandworm, but they were identified, and we have pictures of these guys. So it may be that, and I have also, absolutely heard that intelligence agencies within the U.S., like the NSA, trace cryptocurrency for these national security investigations, that they were even fooled by the apparent privacy of Bitcoin, and that their cryptocurrency payments they used to try to cover their tracks were traced.
Well, we're at time, but I have to say this has been a remarkable discussion. So a couple of closing remarks. First of all, I thought three-dimensional chess was like bad and hard, but this sounds to me like, many multiples of three-dimensional chess that I think that is sort of has a lot of different players in it. So thank you so much for sort of illuminating what some of that story is. Tracers in the Dark by Andy Greenberg is a book well worth reading, not just because it'll teach you so much about what we don't know yet or might not know about cryptocurrency, crypto criminals, crypto law enforcement, etc. But also because it really focuses on persons and not just sort of the legal regime and the financial regime. And I really think it illuminates a dark story that an unclear story. And so I really urge you to read this book. I also want to say we want to look forward to Joe Cox's book, A Dark Wire, when it comes out. Joe, when is that coming out? Do you know? Do you have a pub date?
I don't ask me that.
Okay, so I'll
let you know.
Yeah, okay, we'll put that back behind the curtain. But I'm looking forward to it. I think this is a really wonderful topic that you've both given us some insights into, and I can't wait to have you both back. So thank you very much. Thank you to our audience, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks so much, Karen. Thanks, Joe.